Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is historian James Hansen. Dr. Hansen taught for 32 years at Auburn University, and while he was there, he wrote several books for NASA, including a biography of Neil Armstrong and a study of the Challenger disaster. Hansen's latest book is the story of two men who rowed across the Atlantic separately. I spoke with James Hansen in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Well, Jim, thank you very much for driving down here.
My pleasure.
It's a hot day, and it's always nice and cool in here anyway.
It's very nice.
You had a long career at Auburn.
I did, 32 years.
86.
86 I started and then retired in 2018.
Oh, it has been a little while then.
Yeah, and I was chairman of the history department for 4 years. In fact, I'm not sure this is recorded anywhere, but Auburn, when I arrived, and from its history, I always had headships, not chairmanships. And I think I was the first elected chair in the history of the university. And now the entire university, over the course of the last few decades, everything's a chairmanship now instead of a headship.
They come and go.
Yeah, and
they
come
don't
and
stay
go.
forever.
Yeah.
Well, I had my career right here, 54 years. But one of the things that I came to know, because I had a lot of friends. Bert Hitchcock was a good friend. David Jeffrey, who had been there before you, and other people. A lot of people on campus never would say aloud what an excellent English department Auburn had, and what a first-rate history department Auburn had. People here kind of,
sure,
that was just not something you were supposed to talk about.
Sure.
But because I had spent a lot of time at Pebble Hill working for Jay Lamar and working with Bert Hitchcock and other people, I knew, and I thought, well, that
and it's
be
really
said.
silly, isn't it? Because both institutions have awfully good faculties and great students, and so for us to let the fandom of sports interfere with our respect for each other as scholars and teachers, it's silly.
Well, the smart people didn't let them. Wayne Flint was over here on the editorial board of the press and so on. So people made it work. During those years, we will be talking about rowing across the Atlantic Ocean, but you had a number of books. How many? 5, 6? How many did you write for or about NASA?
Probably right in the neighborhood of 5 or 6.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I've done some things that sort of fed off of that. I've done 3 different books on Neil Armstrong's life. One, the authorized biography, which was published in 2005.
Yeah.
And then after he died in 2012, then his materials, that's much of which I had seen for the book, but a lot more then was sent out by the family to the archives at Purdue University, which was his alma mater. And so I went back after that material got to Purdue. I went into the archives to see some things that I hadn't seen before, including a lot of letters. So we ended up publishing 2 volumes, letters to Neil Armstrong and or Dear Neil Armstrong, and then we had the second volume, The Reluctant Icon. And the letters were incredible because what was written to him, here you have this global icon, people project all kinds of meanings onto him, and he got all kinds of letters. And you can imagine lots of crazy stuff, UFO people that wanted to, and other sorts of things. So I ended up making a collection of different letters, some of which I have Neil responding to. He kept photocopies or carbon copies back then of everything. And so those 2 volumes really kind of end my relationship with the Armstrong biography, but are really important additions to the main story.
Did you see letters from people who think that the moon landing and so on was faked?
Oh, absolutely. and he had, a standard letter that went out on various subjects, but sometimes the letter that it would rile him up to such an extent. I remember there was a teacher from Lebanon, not Lebanon, that was where Neil was at, from Sydney, Ohio. I think an elementary school teacher or a middle school teacher who was really questioning whether the moon landing had happened. And Neil was very bothered by that because here's a science teacher just down the road from where he grew up, actually. So I look for letters like that were kind of not just boilerplate responses, but actual personal responses back.
In our lifetimes, I mean, these things, well, they used to come and go. Now they seem to have come and stayed.
Come and stay and grow.
But my favorite the one I just can't, they all make me dizzy, but the flat earth people are seriously.
Right.
All right, fine, vaccines, flat or whatever.
Yeah, I thought we had that taken care of back with Copernicus and Galileo. So.
When you were doing, you wrote what must have been a very painful book about the Challenger disaster.
Yeah.
In which people learned what O-rings were.
Yeah.
Did you get to go to launches? Did you spend a lot of time at what was Cape Kennedy, Cape Canaveral?
Well, not so much at those, although I did attend launches and I did go to most of the different NASA facilities. But when I left graduate school at Ohio State in 1981, my one good job offer, and it came out of the blue, literally, was to do a book for NASA. And it was literally like a postdoctoral fellowship, So I did a book, and where I was at was in Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia, which is in a tidewater area. Yeah. And it's really the oldest of all of the NASA laboratories. It goes back before NASA. NASA started in 1958 in response to Sputnik. But back during World War I, the federal government created an agency called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. So it was trying to get a research base that would feed into helping the design of American airplanes. And so that's what my first book was all about, what happened at Langley from the 1915, or really 1917 when the lab gets started, to when NASA gets started. And so that introduced me to, I had studied the history of science, and it was mostly all European-related science of the early modern period.
Where were you a graduate student?
Ohio State University, graduated in 81, and originally I was just studying early modern European history, Louis XIV and the Enlightenment, but I took a course with a woman, June Fulmer, who was a chemist that was teaching history of science. And I was just fascinated because it's intellectual history. It's got all the different types of history wrapped up into it. But she was such a solid teacher that I ended up switching over and I did my doctoral research under her.
History of varieties of science. I recently read the biography of Da Vinci.
Yeah.
And you think, holy cow,
was it's a great field, and I've stayed sort of active in it. But when I got the position to do the book for NASA, and then they wanted me to do a sequel to it, a second volume, it really was history of technology. It was engineering, because even though there were scientists that kind of were, most of them, they were looking for practical solutions, and scientists don't always do that. But the people at Langley, the ones at Langley, what's interesting is when NASA is created in '58, the core, we think in Alabama that it's all Marshall Space Flight Center and the von Braun team coming in, and that's crucially important. But the NACA really provides most of the core for the early NASA operation. Men like Bob Gilruth, who was became head of Johnson Space Center, Chris Kraft, the voice of Project Mercury. Right. Those guys all cut their teeth at Langley back in the 30s and 40s in aeronautical engineering. They worked on airplanes. And so they had to learn celestial navigation. They had to learn a lot of things to transition. And so my second book, called Spaceflight Revolution, which came out about 5 years after the first book on Langley, looks at that transition and how all of these people in this culture that was meant for one thing ends up doing something else.
The astronauts, obviously terrifically brave folks, rowing across the ocean is well beyond brave, all the way to foolhardy. Are you an adventurer? Do you bungee jump or leap from airplanes or anything?
No, that's why this book is such a departure for me, because in modern day life, it's hard not to have to fly commercially around the world, in fact. But I'm a little bit of an anxious flyer, and I'm hardly a daredevil at all. But what happened is, and again, it connects back to my NASA. When I was working on the Armstrong book, in the papers for Armstrong, I found a copy of a telegram that was sent by the NASA astronauts, by the Apollo 11 crew, they sent the telegram when they were in quarantine after coming back from the moon. They had like a 2-week period. When
who knew?
Everybody was worried about bringing home bacteria,
Right,
germs
right.
of some sort. The Andromeda strain with the Michael Crichton novel
Yes,
was made
yes.
into a movie. And so there was a telegram. When they're in the quarantine, they've got a lot of time on their hands. And they were reading lots of newspapers and magazines and watching television. But in the Miami Herald, they saw a story about this British guy, John Fairfax, just landing at Hollywood Beach on Florida after rowing a boat by himself across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yes.
And Mike Collins and Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong started talking about this, and they said, well, that's, compared to what we've done, this guy's really nuts. I mean, we would never have tried that. We had mission control behind us. We had, we were in voice communications, and
Yes.
the spacecraft was in communications almost the entire time, except for going through the atmosphere and behind the other side of the moon. And so they wrote this really cool telegram, and I had filed it away kind of in the back of my mind. That was John Fairfax.
Yes.
And and so when COVID came around and I started to knock around the house trying to find something to do. I had no plans really on writing another book. I was retired from the university, but I did read during COVID. I ordered a lot of books from Amazon, and I read a lot of books, and I was reading about adventure stuff. I mean, Shackleton's expedition to the Antarctic. Perry, assaults on Everest. I was reading all of that stuff, and it clicked back. Well, I know a little. There's a story back there that I remember from this telegram, and I thought, well, let's look into this. And what I found out was John Fairfax, who was the one that landed at Hollywood Beach, Florida, just the day before the moon landing was taking place. It was like unbelievable.
That is too bad for him.
Not good for his publicity.
No.
Although there was quite a crowd that was waiting for him because they knew Miami television and that they had paid some attention to it.
Fairfax, there are these. It's interesting how one moves along through McLean and Fairfax. McLean is rowing from Nova Scotia to Ireland. Fairfax is rowing from Canary Islands to Florida.
That's right. Yeah.
And what most people would not know is that each one of them was hoped to be aided by Fairfax by the trade winds, and then McLean by the Gulf Stream
coming back. Yep.
And both of them,
especially Fairfax. I mean, Fairfax left in January, and one of the reasons that he could leave then was, and McLean left in April of 1969, is that you don't want to fly the North Atlantic in a rowboat in the middle of the winter.
No.
Winter storms are terrible, the freezing cold. So he had to wait until April. And even then, he ran into some pretty frigid weather and frozen feet and toes and hands.
The food, over the last couple of weeks, if somebody asks me what I'm doing, I'm either reading this or getting ready to speak with you, and somebody says, they always say, and I'm sure they ask you, what did they eat?
Yeah.
And it oddly a lot like space travel.
Yeah. They both made arrangements with, McLean through his paratrooper. He was still in the active duty military in the British Army. So they had lots of tin foods and things that they could, and they agreed to provide him with it. Fairfax had an arrangement with like a food company that was Horlicks, I think was the name of it in England, and they prepared a lot of these foods. And Fairfax got so tired of eating the same stuff. He was a really funny guy. And it wasn't just that, but when he took off from the Canary Islands, he thought those trade winds were going to blow him west pretty quickly. Well, I have a map of both of the routes, and you look at like hairpin turns and curlicues. The winds that normally blow from east to west across that part of the Atlantic weren't doing it. And I think it was like 10 days to 2 weeks. He saw land after leaving Canary, and it was the coast of Africa.
He was
going backwards.
Yes.
And so he got so tired, and the oarsmanship required. McLean kept track of how many oar strokes it would take in a certain day. And the one day that he counted, he got up to 24,000 and stopped.
Oh,
I mean, I can't imagine.
I'm exhausted.
I can't imagine that. Fairfax got so tired and his belt was so heavy, a lot of it with this food, he threw almost all of his food overboard.
And then he caught fish for the rest of the journey.
Fish, caught shark. He caught whatever he could catch. But he went many days pretty hungry and dehydrated.
There was one little wrinkle about the food that I was more curious about because I don't think I quite understood it. They could boil water. They had to boil water.
Yeah, they had a little camp stove that oil
was
power.
Gas?
Gas, yeah, gas.
Yeah, and lots of matches.
Yeah.
With 50-foot waves crashing all over them.
Yeah, right.
Oh my God, what an awful mess.
But, neither one of them really had much of a cover. You might imagine that they had, McLean had, Fairfax's boat was a little more sophisticated. He had a really expert shipbuilder named Uffa Fox, who was pretty well known. He was a sailor and he sailed with the royal family some and everything. And he designed a really interesting boat that was, one of the features was it was self-bailing. So as water would come in, there were like sluiceways that were built into the part of the boat the water would escape. Well, Tom McLean had a dory, which was a kind of a fishing boat, rowboat that the English used, but so did the Newfoundlanders up in the Grand Banks. And when he got water into his boat, he got a lot of water into the boat. It didn't self-bail. He had a can. And so he was bailing out his boat a lot of times.
I think I don't know, it's only funny if you're essentially sadistic, which I was at that moment. I thought, this guy's rowing for 10 days and he's losing ground. He's not getting anywhere. Yeah. I was amused. We don't know each other, but as I was reading your take on the two of them, I could feel a sniff of disapproval about Fairfax. Fairfax, when he saw a ship, and if he hailed the ship, he would go aboard, drink scotch, have a hot shower, eat good food.
I counted it up how many times. I had his logbooks, and I think 10 different times he availed himself of those sorts of amenities. And what's funny about it is, the organization that that handles the records, maintains the records, and certifies the records, is the Ocean Rowing International. It's based out of London.
Oh my God, there is one, huh?
Yeah, but they apparently did not care or did not know that Fairfax had taken these stops. Now, he did the complete row, so maybe if you want to
Well, nobody helped him, exactly.
Nobody helped him, although it's funny, at the very end of his row, he's coming into to the beach in Florida, and he's out of his boat, and I think maybe before he gets out of his boat, which he's dragging in with him, there's a boat that he kind of calls as if he wants them to haul him in, pull the boat in, and the crowd starts to boo.
Don't do that.
No, you can't do that. There was some disapproval. Honestly, I do think McLean, who was this really, the backgrounds to these guys are what really fascinated me.
Well, McLean was a paratrooper in Britain, and then OSS.
Well, not OSS, but SAS.
I'm sorry,
Special
SAS.
Services, and
right.
Kind of ended up kind of like a Navy SEAL would be.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
he was a purist in terms of what's interesting, he had never rowed a boat except for maybe on a lake or a river somewhere growing up. But he had no experience with ocean rowing at all. When he just decided, I'm going to give this a go. I think one person, because a twosome British paratroopers had just done it the year before. Ridgway and Blythe, and he knew them actually. And so one day, in the mess hall or something, when they're talking about Ridgway and Blythe just being able to do this, very challenging, but they made it. Tom said, "Well, I think one person could do that." He had no basis for thinking that at all, but he sort of then grew. The idea grew, and he committed himself to doing it. And
your descriptions of the physical toll for McLean, it was, if not largely hands and feet.
Yeah.
I mean, he might have lost his feet.
Yeah, there's one picture I think we have in the book. At least I've seen the picture that his hands become terribly blistered and bloody from from the oars, and he has, he had different kinds of gloves that the fishermen of Newfoundland had given him to try to, I think they're Portuguese in origins, to try to help with that. But when you're rowing the boat, I mean, he was on the sea for 70 days. And, I don't know, I don't think every day was 24,000 oar strokes, because some days, in bad weather, he would just hunker down throughout the
Bail out the boat.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
And also there was I forget what it was called now. I'm losing some of my technical details. But you could, in order not to go backwards too much, you could throw out something that would, like an anchor, that would keep you.
Sea anchor?
A sea anchor.
That, yeah.
And
something like that.
There's another name for it. And so he would do that, and then he would just hunker down for the day. So he isn't rowing like that every day. But I mean, the physical torture of doing this, maybe we shouldn't begrudge Fairfax, but Tom wasn't going to do it. He had opportunities. Ships went by him, and all he would ever ask for is a fix. He wanted a navigational fix.
Yes, right.
Yeah, he wanted to know where am I? I mean, they have sextants, but the weather, if it's not good enough, you don't get your sighting, and even then, you got a moving rowboat, and you may not get a very good one.
In the summer of '69, we did not yet have GPS in a handy way.
Yeah. Now, there's a lot of ocean rowing attempts that are going on every year. Probably right as we speak, there's guys on the ocean, and girls too, women too, they have it easy compared to what these two guys did. Yeah. And
why is it easier?
Well, they've got satellite, they have GPS.
They have got more technology, surely.
They've got lots, and their boat designs are improved.
Is that right?
But there aren't too many, honestly. In fact, I can't think of anybody in the past many years that have tried to do it solo. They're doing it in groups, they're doing it as teams, and it's really can become almost a sport. I mean, I wouldn't call what these guys did a sport, because I don't know where the fun is in that. I mean, there has to be some degree of fun in it. But they were doing it for other reasons. They were doing it to prove something to themselves and maybe to the world too. Both of them had been, orphans, brought up without a father. Really, I'm not sure I would have written the book, decided to write the book. I mean, as fascinating and exciting as the actual rows are, just what they did on the water. It was really what I learned about who they were. I mean, because that was my main question.
There's a good deal of biography. Of biographies.
Absolutely.
The two of them.
That was my question, really. What sort of person does this? What motivates somebody to do something that's as crazy as this? And I think through you can only understand that biographically. And the biographies of both of them they're totally contrasting, except for the fact that they both were illegitimate children.
Both very, very physical men, though.
Yeah.
And I have no connection to notions like toxic masculinity, but these guys were as masculine as, of course, now women row across the ocean too.
Ways.
So yes,
I mean similar but different, very different ways.
One of them sought publicity and one didn't.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fairfax seems to have a sense of celebrity, and McLean not.
No, very much so. And where that comes from in a person is, hard to put your thumb on. I mean, Tom's upraising was in an orphanage, a tough, Protestant English. It was more like Oliver Twist. I mean, it's like a Dickens story for him.
Yes.
And so he comes out and he gets away from the orphanage as quickly as he can and gets himself into the British Army, which someone who'd gone through the rigors of the orphanage. For him, the rigors of British Army were maybe kind of easier in some respects.
Well, that is for him. And I think for lots of young men, right this red hot minute,
Sure.
The military is a kind of refuge. It's orderly, it's sane, it's reliable. It's not. There's there may be some tough times, but there's not the random sadism that you can find in a foster home or an orphanage.
Fairfax, grew up. He was the child of a BBC journalist who had been in Rome before the war, and a Bulgarian mother who had come with her family to Rome, and was kind of a fascist family, honestly. And he grew up as a boy in fascist Rome, and his mother was apparently some sort of a prostitute that took care of some folks in the Mussolini regime. So when the war ended, where did they go? She took him to Argentina,
yes,
where a lot of fascists end up.
The boys from Brazil.
And so, and when he's there, when he's in Italy still, he's a Boy Scout, but it's not the American Boy Scouts or the Boy Scout organization we think of. It's more like the Hitler Youth. It's the Italian version of Hitler Youth. And one thing that Fairfax talks about doing, and is in the book, is that he's camping as a scout when he's maybe 7 or 8 years old, and he's mad at the camp counselor, and so he takes his gun and he shoots into the tent trying to kill. And so he's shooting at different people, and he doesn't kill anybody, fortunately. But it's a sign of what's to come, because he does some things that you almost believe could not have been true, but I think they are.
It is Fairfax, isn't it, with his girlfriend Sylvia Cook.
Sylvia Cook. And Sylvia was a great source of material for me.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
And they row across the Pacific?
Afterwards.
3
years later, 72. And then that's a book too. I mean, I'm not going to write that one because they've done a memoir. But yeah, they go from San Francisco to Australia, a man and a woman. But they make stops along the way. And then they end up getting caught in a typhoon right off the coast of New Zealand, and they really almost perish as a result. So it's a heck of what happens to these guys after this is, I had to write a postscript for each one of them. Postscript McLean, postscript Fairfax, to just let readers know what these guys do later, because they're doing crazy stuff for the rest of their lives.
McLean opens an outdoor center.
Yeah.
In Scotland?
Northwest Scotland.
But Fairfax goes to Las Vegas.
Yeah, he's a professional gambler. In fact, he becomes very famous out there. In his obituary when he dies in 2012, the Las Vegas papers give him like a New York Times review. Because he's become a well-known person.
He was a very colorful fellow. We have less than 10 seconds, actually, but you are writing again. What is going to be the next book?
Well, it's a book that I didn't expect to write either, but I'm writing a marital biography of Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. You would think that everything there is to say about the Lindberghs has been written, but I think I have a new angle, I have a new material, and I think I've got a story that needs to be told.
The Charles Lindbergh. I will read it, and we will talk about it, because I don't know of anybody else who achieved the pinnacle of world celebrity when he circled the Eiffel Tower, and then he was essentially some kind of proto-Nazi by 1940, 41, and was held in very low esteem.
Yeah.
And
I delved
all of that
very deeply into the context.
So did Philip Roth.
Yeah, he did a little too deeply in his case.
Well, he was writing fiction, but not much.
Yeah.
We are, unfortunately, out of time, but thank you very much.
You bet, Don.
Completely Mad will delight to people who read it, absolutely. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.